Dr. John Carter had never felt entirely at ease in cities. Tall buildings, traffic noise, and the relentless pace of urban life wore him down during his years at medical school in Chicago. He dreamed of something simpler, something that harkened back to the close-knit communities he'd visited with his family as a child. So, when he finished his residency in 1980, John jumped at the chance to relocate to the rural town of Willowbrook, nestled on the edge of the Appalachian Mountains. Willowbrook was a town forgotten by time. No chain stores, no stoplights, and hardly any strangers passed through. The nearest hospital was hours away, and folks had to rely on an old clinic that had fallen into disrepair. John saw his role as both doctor and counselor. He knew that, to gain the trust of Willowbrook's residents, he'd need to understand not just their illnesses, but also their lives. However, one topic puzzled him. The people of Willowbrook were deeply superstitious. They avoided certain places, carried talismans, and oddly enough, would never venture outside after dark. Once the sun dipped behind the mountains, doors locked, windows closed, and people vanished into their homes as if the night itself were a predator lying in wait. John dismissed it as folklore, harmless beliefs passed down through generations. Yet, he noticed that even those who seemed otherwise rational and modern shared a sense of unease when it came to the night. One evening, he asked Mrs. Avery, a feisty old woman who had lived in Willowbrook all her life, about the town's fear of the dark. "Ah, Dr. Carter," she replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're not from here, so you don't know. They say the veil of midnight haunts our woods." "The veil of midnight?" John echoed, struggling to keep his tone casual. Mrs. Avery leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "A woman betrayed by her husband many years ago. She wanders the woods, crying for justice, or for someone to take her place." John shivered despite himself. Mrs. Avery's gaze remained fixed on him, almost as if she could see the doubt in his eyes. "Stay indoors after dark, Dr. Carter," she warned. "Some things are best left alone." As the weeks passed, John continued his routine. Despite the townsfolk's warnings, he often went on evening walks to clear his mind. There was something liberating about the crisp mountain air and the solitude of the outdoors. It reminded him of his childhood, when he'd spent countless summer nights exploring the woods with nothing but a flashlight and his curiosity. One particularly restless night, John found himself pacing his small living room. The clock read 11:45 p.m., but he felt no urge to sleep. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and decided to take a short walk to the river that ran along the edge of town. He was aware that he was breaking an unspoken rule, but he reasoned that a quick stroll wouldn't hurt. Stepping outside, John was struck by the eerie stillness. There was no wind, no sound of animals, just an unnatural silence that blanketed the town. The air was so still it felt like he was moving through thick fog, even though the sky was clear. As he walked toward the river, a feeling of unease crept over him, but he pushed it aside. The river was beautiful under the moonlight, its surface like glass, reflecting the stars above. As John took in the view, a sound drifted through the air, a faint, sorrowful cry. At first, he thought it was an animal, perhaps a fox or coyote. But as he listened closer, he realized it was the voice of a woman. The cry was low and heart-wrenching, filled with a pain that made John's skin prickle. He scanned the area, trying to locate the source, and his eyes fell upon a figure standing near the water's edge, a woman draped in a dark veil, her shoulders shaking as if she were weeping. "Ma'am?" he called softly, stepping closer. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. Her sobs grew louder, echoing off the trees, and John hesitated. Something about her seemed wrong. The air around her was colder, like a pocket of winter in the middle of spring. "Ma'am?" he repeated, his voice wavering. Slowly, the woman turned. Her veil obscured her face, but her posture was one of complete despair. "He betrayed me," she whispered, her voice cracking. He brought another woman into our home and cast me aside. John's heart ached at her words. I'm sorry to hear that, he said gently. Do you need help? I need justice, she interrupted, her tone shifting. But justice is elusive here. He took a step closer, intending to offer his assistance, but she raised a hand, stopping him. You wouldn't understand, she murmured. You are an outsider. Something in her voice made him shiver, but he felt compelled to help. I may be an outsider, but that doesn't mean I can't help you. Let me speak to the town elders. Perhaps they can offer some assistance. The woman remained silent, then nodded slowly. Very well. Follow me, she whispered, her voice like a breath of wind. She turned and began walking along the riverbank, her movements unnaturally smooth, almost as if she were gliding. John followed her, his footsteps crunching against the fallen leaves. The only sound was the faint chiming of bells, like those of an old anklet, keeping rhythm with her steps. After several minutes, he realized that they were moving deeper into the woods. Shadows grew longer, the trees seeming to close in around them, and an oppressive silence filled the air. He tried to make small talk to ease the tension, asking her about her name, but she gave no answer. Her silence was unsettling, and his earlier confidence began to wane. As they reached a clearing, John stopped. Ma'am, are you sure we're going in the right direction? She paused and turned to face him. This is the only path, for justice, she replied cryptically, her voice barely above a whisper. John felt an instinctual urge to turn back, but he fought it, unwilling to abandon her. But then he noticed something strange. Her veil was now billowing despite the stillness in the air, as if an invisible force were lifting it. Beneath it, he glimpsed a face pale and ethereal, with hollow eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow and rage. Who are you? He asked, his voice trembling. In response, she lifted a hand toward him. Her fingers were icy to the touch, and a bone-chilling cold spread through his body. I am what they made me, she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. They cast me aside, abandoned me, left me with nothing but my pain and my vengeance. Panic surged through John, and he took a step back, breaking free from her grasp. He stumbled, his mind reeling, as the woman's face contorted into an expression of pure hatred. No one escapes the veil of midnight, she hissed, her voice now a venomous snarl. John turned and ran, his heart pounding as he darted through the trees. The sound of her laughter followed him, a haunting melody that echoed in his ears. He glanced over his shoulder, and his blood turned to ice. She was gliding after him, her veil flowing behind her like a shadow. Desperation fueled his legs, and he ran faster, pushing through branches and stumbling over roots. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees warping into grotesque shapes, as if the very landscape were conspiring to trap him. Just as he thought he'd lost her, he tripped, crashing to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, gasping for breath, but she was gone. The forest was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. He could still feel the icy chill lingering in the air, the memory of her hollow eyes etched into his mind. Over the next few days, John tried to shake off the encounter. He rationalized it as a hallucination, perhaps brought on by exhaustion. Yet he couldn't ignore the unease that lingered, the sense that he was being watched. Shadows seemed darker, every creak and whisper taking on a sinister edge. One evening, as he closed the clinic, he found a note slipped under the door. The handwriting was delicate, almost old-fashioned, and it read, "Justice awaits those who heed the call." John's hands shook as he read the note, and he felt the icy touch of dread settle over him. That night, he couldn't sleep. Visions of the veiled woman haunted him, her voice echoing in his mind, accusing him, beckoning him to the river. Unable to resist, he ventured out once more, driven by a compulsion he couldn't understand. The river was quiet, shrouded in mist, and as he approached, he saw her standing there, just as before. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because you promised to help me," she replied, her tone gentle but edged with a darkness he couldn't ignore. "But you have failed. Justice is still denied." Desperation flickered in her hollow eyes, and John felt a pang of sympathy mixed with terror. "Tell me how I can help you. Please, I want to understand." She stepped closer, the cold radiating from her body piercing his skin. "I was cast out, betrayed by the man I loved. My spirit remains bound to this place, trapped by the pain they caused. I need someone to bear witness to my suffering, to take my place." John's heart raced as her words sank in. "Take your place?" he echoed, horror dawning on him. "Yes," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. "Free me from this torment and take my pain as your own." He recoiled, but her grip tightened, her fingers like iron. "No," he gasped, struggling to break free. "I can't. I won't." The woman's eyes darkened, and a sinister smile twisted her lips. "Then suffer as I have suffered," she spat, her voice like a venomous hiss. The world spun around him, and John felt himself being pulled into darkness. Visions flashed before his eyes, a man casting her out, a betrayal that shattered her heart, the anguish of being forgotten. Her pain seeped into his soul, filling him with a sorrow so deep it threatened to consume him. When he awoke, he was lying by the river, the sun rising over the horizon. The veil was gone, but the memory of her touch lingered, a permanent scar etched into his mind. From that day on, John never ventured out after dark, and the townsfolk noticed a change in him, a haunted look in his eyes, as if he'd seen something that couldn't be explained. Years later, the tale of the Veil of Midnight continued to haunt Willowbrook, but now it included a new story, a doctor who had dared to seek justice and found only darkness. They say the Veil of Midnight still waits by the river, her sorrow and vengeance echoing through the trees. Those who venture out at night sometimes hear her cries, a reminder of the price of betrayal and the danger of promises unkept.